Number 10. Nabta Playa, the stone circle. Older than Egypt, long before pyramids rose beside the Nile, people were gathering far to the south in a desert that once looked nothing like the desert we know today. Nabta Playa lies in the Nubian desert, a place now harsh, dry, and almost empty. But thousands of years before Egypt became the symbol of ancient civilization, seasonal rains filled shallow lakes across this basin. Grasslands spread around the water. Herding communities moved cattle through the landscape, returned with the seasons, buried their dead, and placed stones in patterns that still disturbed the timeline of early civilization. They had no writing, no pharaohs, no pyramids, and no cities in the familiar sense, yet they were already building sacred spaces where survival, sky, animals, and ritual seemed to have met. But the most famous feature at Nabta Playa is a stone circle, built more than 7,000 years ago. The stones are not gigantic like those at Stonehenge, but their meaning may be far larger than their size. Some researchers believe the arrangement was linked to the movement of the sun, possibly marking the summer solstice, a moment that would have mattered deeply to people waiting for seasonal rains. If that interpretation is correct, the builders were not simply arranging rocks in the sand. They were turning the sky into a calendar. They were using the heavens to track time, water, and survival in a fragile world where the return of rain could decide whether people and cattle lived or died. What makes Nabta Playa unsettling is how strongly it seems to echo later Egypt. The people who gathered there lived long before dynastic kings, but they already appear to have connected cattle, burial, astronomy, and sacred landscape in ways that would become central to Nile Valley religion. At the site, archaeologists found stone alignments, burial features, and evidence that cattle held symbolic power far beyond ordinary food or wealth. Later Egypt would fill its mythology with sky gods, solar cycles, sacred animals, death rituals, and cosmic order. Nabta Playa raises the possibility that some of those ideas did not begin in temples beside the Nile. They may have been older memories carried out of a dying desert. The landscape itself may explain how those memories moved. Nabta Playa belonged to the Green Sahara, a lost world of lakes, grasslands, animals, and human movement. But the climate changed, the rains weakened, lakes dried. But the land that had supported herders became harder to survive in, and people were forced toward more reliable water, especially the Nile. If communities connected to Nabta Playa migrated into the Nile Valley, they may have carried with them knowledge of stars, cattle rituals, seasonal gatherings, and sacred alignments. The desert did not only erase their world, it may have pushed fragments of that world into the place where Egypt would later rise. That is why Nabta Playa challenges the way we imagine civilization. We often look for cities, palaces, writing, armies, and kings, but the roots of civilization may have begun earlier in forms that are easier to miss. A circle of stones, a burial under desert ground, a cattle offering, a line aimed at the sun, a gathering beside a seasonal lake. These people were not primitive because they lacked pyramids. They were solving different problems. They were organizing movement, measuring time, honoring the dead, and giving meaning to a landscape that was changing around them. That is why Nabta Playa belongs among the lost civilizations that may be older than history. It is not an empire, but it may preserve one of the deep foundations from which later civilization grew, before Egypt had kings, before pyramids rose, before names were carved into stone. People in a greener Sahara were already watching the heavens and building places where earth, sky, cattle, water, and death came together. History remembers the pharaohs because they built in stone on a grand scale. But Nabta Playa whispers something older. The sacred world of Egypt may have begun long before Egypt had a name. Number 9, Jericho, the walled settlement before kings, long before empires raised stone fortresses, long before armies marched under royal banners, long before writing gave names to rulers and wars, people at Jericho were already building walls. The site lies near a spring in the Jordan Valley, one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on Earth, and its earliest layers reach back into a world that should not have known urban defense, monumental construction, or large-scale organization. Around 10,000 years ago, people there were living in a settlement that looked nothing like the wandering hunter-gatherer camps we often imagine for the early Neolithic. They built houses, stored food, gathered around reliable water, and surrounded their community with a massive stone wall. Most disturbing of all, they built a tower rising from the settlement like a warning from a time before kings. But the wall of ancient Jericho forces a question that archaeology still struggles to answer. What were they afraid of? Walls are not simple things. They require planning, labor, tools, leadership, and a reason strong enough to make a community spend enormous energy moving stone instead of gathering food. Some researchers have argued that the wall may have protected the settlement from floods or mud flows rather than enemies. Others see it as evidence of conflict, territorial defense, or social power. Either way, the implication is unsettling. Thousands of years before the first known states, before armies, taxes, palaces, or written law, people at Jericho were already organizing themselves around boundaries. They were already separating inside from outside, safe from dangerous, us from them. The tower deepens the mystery. It's built from stone and rising inside the wall. It was not a casual structure. It would have taken coordinated labor and engineering knowledge to construct. A staircase ran through it, suggesting that people entered and climbed within the tower itself. But its purpose remains unclear. Was it defensive, ceremonial, a symbol of communal identity, a monument to the dead, a way to mark the movement of the sun or the shadow across the settlement? We do not know. That uncertainty is what makes Jericho feel older than the story of civilization. It gives us architecture before explanation, power before names, and monumentality before the written word. What makes Jericho especially haunting is that it appeared at the threshold between two worlds. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans had survived by moving through landscapes, following animals, plants, seasons, and water. But Jericho belonged to the moment when people began to stay. Staying changed everything. It made food storage necessary. It made territory valuable. It made neighbors permanent. It made the dead remain close. It made conflict more likely because a settled place can be attacked, stolen, defended, inherited, and remembered. The wall around Jericho may be one of the earliest visible signs that humanity had crossed a line. We were no longer only surviving inside nature. We were beginning to build against it and against each other. The people of early Jericho did not leave us writing, so their intentions remain silent. We do not know what language they spoke, what stories they told, what names they gave the spring, the wall, the tower, or the dead buried beneath their floors. But the stones showed that they were not simple. They understood labor, planning, permanence, and fear, and they could gather enough people to build something no single family could create alone. That means some form of authority, ritual, emergency, or shared belief held the community together. The wall is not only a structure, it is evidence of a social mind forming before history learned how to describe one. That is why Jericho belongs among the lost civilizations that may be older than history. It was not a civilization in the later sense of kings and written records, but it carried the seeds of everything that would come after. Settlement, defense, construction, stored wealth, social pressure, and the need to protect a place that had become too important to abandon. Before the great cities of Mesopotamia, before Egypt, before the first written laws, Jericho had already raised stone between itself and the world. The tower still asks the same question across 10,000 years. Were they building against flood, enemy, spirit, or fear itself? History does not answer. The wall only stands there, older than kings, reminding us that civilization may have begun the moment humans decided they had something worth defending. Number 8. Ain Ghazal, the people who built giants. From plaster, long before statues of kings filled temples, long before writing recorded the names of gods, a community in what is now Jordan was shaping human figures from plaster and hiding them beneath the earth. The site is called Ain Ghazal, and at first glance it looks like an early farming settlement from the Neolithic world. a place of mud brick houses, domestic animals, crops, and ordinary daily survival. But beneath that surface, archaeologists uncovered something far stranger. Groups of large human statues made from lime plaster, some nearly life-sized, with staring eyes, flat faces, painted details, and bodies that look both human and not quite human. They were among the earliest large-scale human figures ever created, and they appeared thousands of years before the great sculptural traditions of Egypt or Mesopotamia. The making of these figures required more effort than their fragile appearance suggests. Lime plaster was not a simple material. It had to be produced by heating limestone to high temperatures, then mixing and shaping it before it hardened. That meant the people of Ain Ghazal needed fuel, labor, planning, and technical knowledge passed across generations. The statues were built around bundles of reeds and fibers, then coated with plaster, modeled into bodies, faces, and limbs, and finished with eyes that still feel uncomfortably alive. Some figures had two heads, some were busts without full bodies, some had features so stylized that they seem less like portraits and more like beings from a ritual world we cannot enter. What makes Ain Ghazal unsettling is not only that these statues existed, but what happened to them. They were not displayed forever as monuments. They were carefully buried in pits, sometimes in groups, as if the act of hiding them was part of their purpose. The people who made them created human forms with great effort, gave them eyes, faces, and presence, then returned them to the ground. This was not casual disposal, it was ritual concealment. The statues were treated like powerful objects whose lives had to end in a controlled way. They may have represented ancestors, spirits, mythic beings, ritual participants, or something for which modern language has no clean category. We can see their faces, but we cannot hear what those faces meant. Ain Ghazal also belonged to a dangerous turning point in human life. Early farming did not simply make existence easier. It brought crowding, disease, social tension, dependence on crops, and new relationships with animals and land. A people were staying in one place for generations, living near their dead, building memory into houses, and creating rituals to hold communities together under pressures their hunter-gatherer ancestors had not faced in the same way. In that world, the plaster figures may have served as anchors for identity, ancestry, or spiritual protection. They may have helped a growing settlement remember who it was, or they may have controlled fears that came from living too close to other people, too close to the dead, and too close to forces no one could command. The truly haunting part is how little of their belief system survived. Ain Ghazal gives us houses, tools, bones, and statues, but not the words that explain them. No inscription tells us whether these figures were loved, feared, worshipped, mourned, or destroyed as part of a ceremony. Their eyes seem to ask for recognition, but the culture that gave them meaning vanished before history could record it. Later civilizations filled temples with gods and kings whose names survived in stone. Ain Ghazal left behind silent faces, older than those famous worlds, staring out from the beginning of settled life with no story attached. That is why Ain Ghazal belongs among the lost civilizations that may be older than history. It shows that early communities were not only learning to farm and build houses, they were building symbolic worlds, creating human images on a scale that required skill, labor, and shared belief. They were asking questions about death, identity, ancestors, and power long before writing could preserve the answers. The plaster giants are not terrifying because they are monstrous. They are terrifying because they are almost familiar, and they look back at us with human eyes from a time before history, carrying the memory of a people who learned to make faces in their own image, then buried those faces where only the future could find them. Number 7. The Cucuteni Trypillia culture, the mega-settlements that burned themselves thousands of years before the famous cities of Mesopotamia. Enormous settlements were rising across what is now Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania. They belong to the Cucuteni Trypillia culture, a prehistoric world that flourished for millennia before recorded history could preserve its voice. Some of their largest settlements held thousands of people, perhaps even tens of thousands, arranged in vast circular layouts of houses, open spaces and pathways. These were not temporary camps or scattered farming villages. They were organized communities on a scale that forces us to question how many early paths towards civilization existed before the one we usually remember. And yet, they left behind no writing, no clear kings, no palaces, and no explanation for their strangest habit. Again and again, they burned their own settlements to the ground. The houses were built from wood, clay, and wattle, often filled with ovens, storage areas, painted surfaces, and beautifully decorated pottery. Their ceramics remain among the most striking in prehistoric Europe, covered in spirals, curves, and red, black, and white patterns that suggest a symbolic world we can see but cannot read. They farmed, kept animals, stored grain, crafted figurines, and lived in communities large enough to require planning, cooperation, and some kind of shared order. Some sites almost look urban in scale, yet they existed outside the usual definition of early civilization. No written tablets explain who led them. No royal tombs identify rulers. No monument tells us what they believed. Their world survives mainly through clay, ash, pottery, figurines, and the burned outlines of homes. The burning is what makes Cucuteni Trypillia so haunting. Archaeologists have found settlement after settlement where houses were deliberately set on fire. The heat was often so intense that the clay walls hardened almost like ceramic, preserving collapsed buildings in red layers beneath the soil. This was not a random accident repeated once or twice. It happened too often, across too many places, with too much intensity. Some researchers think the burning marked the end of a house's life, a ritual death after generations of use. Others suggest entire settlements were abandoned and burned as part of renewal, purification, migration, or social memory. But the people who lit those fires left us no explanation. They left only the evidence of a world that seemed to destroy itself on purpose. Imagine the scale of that act. A community builds houses, stores food, paints walls, shapes pottery, raises children, and fills a place with memory. Then one day the homes are emptied, the flames are lit, and the settlement becomes smoke. If this was ritual, then houses were not just shelters. They were living parts of the community that needed a ceremonial end. If it was renewal, then destruction may have been a way to keep society together. If it was crisis, then the burned layers may mark repeated moments when something inside the system broke. Every possibility is unsettling because each one suggests a relationship with home, fire, and memory very different from our own. The largest Trypillia megasites deepen the mystery, and a settlement that large should have produced obvious hierarchy, administration, or centralized power, yet the evidence remains difficult to read. How did thousands of people coordinate farming, construction, storage, ritual, and movement without the institutions we expect from later cities? Were these true cities, seasonal gathering centers, ritual landscapes, or something in between? Cucuteni Trypillia challenges the assumption that large communities must always become states, and that civilization must always announce itself through kings. Then the culture faded. The mega-settlements were abandoned. The painted pottery tradition disappeared. New people, new tools, and new ways of life moved across the region. Whatever system had allowed these enormous communities to rise did not survive into written history. But that is why Cucuteni Trypillia belongs among the lost civilizations that may be older than history. It was a world of huge settlements, symbolic art, organized life, and deliberate fire, yet its voice is gone. What remains is the image of a people who built on a massive scale, lived together in ways we still do not fully understand, and then turned their own homes into flames as if the only way to end a world was to burn it clean. Number 6. The Norte Chico civilization, the pyramid builders, without pottery, long before the Inca built roads through the Andes, long before the Maya raised temples in the jungle, and long before the great cities of Mesoamerica became the familiar face of ancient America, a civilization was rising on the dry coast of Peru. It is known today as Norte Chico, or Rurial Cipher, and it flourished more than 4,000 years ago in river valleys surrounded by desert, mountains, and the Pacific Ocean. At first, the landscape seems like the wrong place for one of the world's earliest civilizations. The coast is harsh, the rainfall is almost non-existent, and the desert gives little away for free. Yet here, where survival depended on narrow ribbons of river water and access to the sea, people built monumental centers, sunken plazas, platform mounds, and pyramid-like structures before many better-known ancient worlds reached their height. What makes Norte Chico so strange is that it does not follow the usual script of civilization. Archaeologists often expect early states to come with pottery, elaborate burials, weapons, fortifications, palaces, and clear signs of kingship. Norte Chico gives a different picture. Its people built massive ceremonial architecture, organized labor across valleys, created planned settlements, and maintained exchange, yet they appear to have done much of this without pottery in the earliest phases. That absence is unsettling because pottery is one of the basic markers archaeologists use to track settled life. It stores food, cooks meals, carries water, and preserves cultural style. But here was a society building pyramids and plazas while leaving behind almost none of the ceramic evidence we expect from a civilization. The secret may have been cotton and fish. Along the coast, rich marine resources provided anchovies, sardines, shellfish, and other foods in enormous quantities. Inland valleys produced cotton, gourds, squash, and other crops through irrigation. Cotton could be made into nets, and nets could harvest fish from the sea. The coast and the valleys became locked in a system of exchange. Farmers needed marine food, fishing communities needed cotton, and both depended on coordination. This means Norte Chico may have built complexity, not from grain surpluses alone, but from a partnership between river agriculture and the ocean. It was a civilization balanced between desert and water, between fields and nets, between the inland valley and the Pacific edge. The architecture shows how organized that world became. At sites such as Carroll, huge platform mounds rise from the desert floor, arranged around plazas where people gathered for rituals, ceremonies, music, exchange, and possibly political events. Sunken circular plazas suggest communal gatherings that were not casual meetings, but structured experiences designed to bind people together. The labor required to build these monuments was enormous. Stones had to be collected, carried, packed into fiber bags, and arranged into platforms. Workers had to be fed, plans had to be remembered. Authority, belief, or social obligation had to persuade people to build for something larger than their own households. Even without writing, we can read, the stones make one thing clear. This was not a simple village world. And yet Norte Chico remains strangely silent. There are few clear images of rulers, little evidence of warfare, and no deciphered script explaining who controlled the labor or what gods were honored in the plazas. Some finds suggest the use of Trypillia knot systems, raising the possibility that information was recorded in cords long before the Inca made such devices famous. But if those knots carried names, counts, offerings, laws, or sacred knowledge, their meanings are lost. The civilization may have organized itself through systems we can touch but not understand. It may have recorded memory in fiber instead of clay, in performance instead of inscription, in ritual gathering instead of royal declarations. That is why Norte Chico belongs among the lost civilizations that may be older than history. It proves that civilization did not need to look the way later empires trained us to expect. A people could build monumental centers without pottery, develop complexity without obvious warfare, and organize valleys without leaving kings carved into stone. Their pyramids rose from the Peruvian desert like signals from an alternate beginning, a path where the ocean mattered as much as the field, where cotton nets may have helped feed monuments, and where power hid behind ritual rather than written names. Norte Chico did not become the civilization most people remember. It became something more haunting, proof that the ancient world had more than one way to begin, and that some beginnings left behind only platforms, plazas, and silence. Number 5, the Ubaid culture, the shadow before Sumer wrote its first tablets, before the first great cities of Mesopotamia rose above the southern plains, and before kings carved victories into stone, another world had already taken shape in the marshes and riverlands of ancient Iraq. Archaeologists call it the Ubaid culture, and it flourished before recorded history could explain what it was. To most people, Mesopotamian civilization begins with Sumer, cuneiform, ziggurats, city-states, priests, merchants, and written law. But Sumer did not appear from nothing. Beneath it lies an older layer of villages, temples, trade networks, irrigation, pottery, and beliefs that prepared the ground for everything that followed. The Ubaid were the shadow before Sumer, and without them, the first written civilization may never have taken shape. But the Ubaid world began in farming communities near rivers, marshes, and coastal zones, where survival required cooperation with water. The land was fertile but unstable. Rivers shifted, floods came, marshes expanded and retreated. To live there, people had to manage canals, fields, animals, fish, reeds, and mud brick architecture in a landscape that could feed them or destroy them. Over time, their villages grew larger and more organized. Communal buildings and early temples appeared at some sites, suggesting that ritual and authority were already central to social life. Long before Uruk and people in the Ubaid world were learning the language of civilization. Water control, organized labor, sacred architecture, and exchange. What makes the Ubaid culture unsettling is how much it resembles the beginning of a world we recognize, while remaining almost completely voiceless. Their pottery spread across a wide region, marked by painted designs that appear from southern Mesopotamia into parts of the Gulf, Iran, and Anatolia. Their objects suggest contact over huge distances, with communities sharing styles, materials, and perhaps religious ideas long before written trade records existed. This was not an isolated village culture. It was a network. People were moving goods, techniques, symbols, and habits across landscapes that later civilizations would claim as their own. The strangest remains are the figurines. Some Ubaid sites produced small clay figures with elongated heads, narrow faces, almond-shaped eyes, and bodies that look almost reptilian to modern viewers. Some appear to hold infants. Some have markings or postures that suggest ritual significance. But we do not know whether they represented deities, ancestors, spirits, masked humans, fertility symbols, or something else entirely. Their faces are unsettling because they feel intentional, but unreadable. They look like messages from a symbolic system that vanished before anyone could translate it. The Ubaid also challenges the idea that civilization begins only when writing begins. Writing makes history visible, but it does not create complexity by itself. Before the first tablets, people were already building institutions that writing would later record. Before scribes counted grain in clay, someone had to create fields worth counting. Before temples became economic centers, someone had to turn sacred buildings into places of gathering and authority. Before kings ruled cities, communities had to accept that labor could be organized beyond the household. The Ubaid world may have been where many of these transformations became stable enough to survive. Then the Ubaid horizon faded into what came after. It did not vanish in a single dramatic collapse, but transformed into the Uruk world, where cities expanded, administration intensified, and writing finally emerged. That makes the Ubaid difficult to mourn because they were not simply destroyed. They were absorbed into the civilization that overshadowed them. Their descendants may have become part of Sumer or joined the growing urban world that later called itself by other names. But the original Ubaid voice was lost. The people who shaped the foundations of Mesopotamia were buried beneath the fame of the cities that inherited them. That is why the Ubaid culture belongs among the lost civilizations that may be older than history. It was not the first empire, not the first written state, and not the civilization whose kings became famous. It was something deeper, the preparation layer beneath history itself. The Ubaid built the habits, networks, rituals, and social forms that allowed Sumer to rise. They remind us that the beginning of civilization is rarely the moment when names appear in writing. It is the long, silent work that comes before. Canals cut into mud, temples raised from clay, symbols painted on pottery, strange figures shaped by hand, and a people whose world became the foundation for history while their own story disappeared beneath it. Number 4. The Vinča culture, the symbols that may have been Europe's first writing, long before Sumerian scribes pressed cuneiform into clay, before Egyptian hieroglyphs covered temple walls, and before Europe had cities powerful enough to name themselves in history. A culture along the Danube was marking objects with signs no one can confidently read. The Vinča culture flourished across the Balkans thousands of years before classical Europe existed, spreading through what is now Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and nearby regions. Their settlements were large, their houses organized, their ceramics refined, and their craft traditions far more advanced than the simple village life we often imagine for deep prehistory. But the most unsettling thing they left behind was not a wall, a weapon, or a tomb. It was a system of symbols scratched, painted, and impressed onto clay objects, as if someone was trying to make meaning survive beyond the human voice. The Vinča signs appear on pottery, figurines, spindle whorls, tablets, and ritual objects. Some are simple lines, crosses, chevrons, and grids. Others are more complex arrangements of marks that repeat across different sites and generations. They do not look like random decoration. They appear placed with intention, often in specific positions on objects that carried social or ritual value. To some researchers, this looks like proto-writing, perhaps even one of the earliest attempts in Europe to turn speech, ownership, ritual, identity, or sacred ideas into visible signs. If that is true, then the people of the Vinča world were reaching toward writing long before writing was supposed to arrive in human history. And that possibility is what makes the Vinča culture so powerful and so controversial. The earliest widely accepted writing systems belong to Mesopotamia and Egypt, emerging after the rise of larger urban economies and administration. But the Vinča signs are older. If they were true writing, the timeline of literacy would shift dramatically, and Europe would have produced a symbolic system thousands of years before the scripts that usually begin the story. The problem is that we cannot prove what the signs meant. There is no bilingual inscription, no later alphabet clearly descended from them, no long text that reveals grammar, sound, or language. We have the marks, but not the voice behind them. They may be writing, ritual symbols, clan signs, ownership marks, sacred formulas, or something that does not fit any category we use today. The culture around those symbols was not simple. The Vinča communities built substantial houses, lived in large settlements, produced fine pottery, crafted figurines, and worked with copper at an early date. Their world suggests specialists, exchange, shared styles, and knowledge passed carefully across generations. They were not waiting for civilization to be invented somewhere else. They were building one of Europe's earliest experiments in complexity. The figurines they left behind are especially haunting. Human-like forms with mask-like faces, strange eyes, angular bodies, and markings that seem connected to the same symbolic world as the signs. These objects feel as if they belonged to a belief system that was structured, repeated, and meaningful, yet sealed from us by silence. Then, around the middle of the 5th millennium BCE, the Vinča culture began to collapse. Settlements were abandoned or transformed. The copper production changed. The symbol tradition faded. New populations and new ways of life moved through the Balkans. Whatever path toward complexity the Vinča had been following did not become the dominant path into European history. If their symbols were an early form of writing, then that writing died before it could grow into a script we can read. If they were something else, then that something else vanished just as completely. A whole system of meaning disappeared without leaving a key. That is why the Vinča culture belongs among the lost civilizations that may be older than history. It stands at the edge of one of the deepest questions in archaeology. How many times did humans nearly invent history before one invention survived? The Vinča may have been close to creating writing, or they may have created a symbolic language so different from writing that modern scholars cannot name it properly. Either way, their signs remain like locked doors on clay. They prove that before Europe's recorded past, people were already building communities, working metal, shaping ritual objects, and marking the world with symbols meant to be understood. The tragedy is that they were understood once. They were read by eyes that knew what they meant. Now they survive only as silent marks from a civilization that may have been reaching toward history, just before history lost them. Number 3. The Jōmon, the hunter-gatherers who made the oldest pottery, long before rice fields covered Japan, long before emperors, samurai, cities, or written chronicles, the islands were home to one of the most enduring cultures in human prehistory. They are called the Jōmon, named for the cord-marked patterns pressed into their pottery, and their world lasted for an almost impossible span of time. For thousands of years, they lived across the Japanese archipelago as hunter-gatherers, fishers, foragers, and coastal people, adapting to forests, rivers, shellfish beds, mountains, and changing seas. By the usual rules of civilization, they should have been simple and temporary. They did not rely on full-scale agriculture for most of their history. They did not build empires or leave written kings. Yet they created some of the oldest pottery on Earth and sustained a cultural tradition longer than many civilizations. What makes the Jōmon unsettling is that they break the ladder we use to explain progress. The familiar story says humans settled down because they farmed, then needed pottery to store grain, cook food, and manage surplus. But the Jōmon were making pottery before agriculture became the foundation of their society. Their ceramics were shaped, fired, decorated, and refined across generations. Some vessels were practical, used for cooking and storage. Others became elaborate objects with flame-like rims and complex surfaces that seem almost too dramatic for daily use. These were not people waiting for civilization to arrive. They had already created a material world of astonishing creativity without following the path that Mesopotamia, Egypt, or China would later take. The Japan's islands helped make that possible. Coastal waters offered fish and shellfish. Forests provided nuts, game, wood, and plants. Rivers and seasons gave enough abundance for some groups to remain in stable settlements. Shell middens, pit houses, storage pits, burials, tools, and ritual objects show communities returning to the same places for generations. They were not wandering aimlessly through wilderness. They knew their lands with deep precision, managing seasonal resources and building social lives around continuity. The most haunting objects they left behind are the dogu figurines. These small clay figures appear in strange human-like forms, with large eyes, patterned bodies, exaggerated shapes, and features that resist easy explanation. Some look like masked beings. Some seem female. Some appear broken deliberately, as if damage was part of their purpose. The archaeologists have suggested fertility symbols, healing objects, ancestor figures, protective spirits, or ritual tools. But no one truly knows. The dogu stare back at the modern world with eyes that feel too deliberate to be decoration and too silent to explain themselves. They are proof that the Jōmon were building symbolic worlds as complex as any farming society, even without readable text. That is the deeper challenge of the Jōmon. They show that civilization may not be only about crops, kings, writing, and cities. It may also be about endurance, memory, ritual, craft, and the ability to live with a landscape across immense stretches of time. Later agricultural civilizations rose faster, expanded harder, fought more visibly, and left clearer monuments. But many collapsed within centuries. The Jōmon endured across ages of climate change, shifting coastlines and cultural transformation, leaving behind pottery, figurines, burials, and settlements that suggest a slower, quieter form of complexity. Eventually, that world changed. Rice agriculture and new populations from the Asian mainland transformed the archipelago, bringing different technologies, social structures, and ways of life. The Jōmon did not vanish all at once, but their long cultural pattern gave way to something new. Their descendants blended, adapted, and were absorbed into later histories that no longer carried their old meanings clearly. The pottery remained, the figurines remained, the shell mounds remained, but the stories, songs, rituals, and names behind them disappeared before writing could preserve them. That is why the Jōmon belong among the lost civilizations that may be older than history. That they were not an empire, but they were not simple. They were not farmers in the usual sense, but they were settled enough to create one of the world's longest-lasting cultural traditions. Somewhere in the forests and coasts of prehistoric Japan, people built a world around clay, sea, season, memory, and ritual, and held it together for thousands of years. Their pottery still carries the marks of twisted cord, but the hands that pressed those patterns into wet clay are gone. What remains is the uncomfortable possibility that the Jōmon understood a form of civilization that history never learned how to name. Number 2. Göbekli Tepe, the builders who buried their own sacred world, long before farming villages filled the hills of Mesopotamia, long before pottery became common, long before cities, kings, walls, or written prayers. People gathered on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey and raised stones that should not have existed yet. The place is now called Göbekli Tepe, and it sits like a wound in the old timeline of civilization. Beneath the soil, archaeologists uncovered circular enclosures filled with massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some carved with foxes, snakes, scorpions, vultures, wild boars, and strange abstract symbols. These stones were erected more than 11,000 years ago, at a time when the people who built them were supposed to be hunter-gatherers moving through the landscape, not organizing labor to construct monumental sacred architecture. But that is what makes Göbekli Tepe so disturbing. For generations, the accepted story was simple. Humans learned agriculture. Agriculture created surplus food. Surplus allowed permanent settlement, and settled life eventually produced temples. Göbekli Tepe reverses that order. It suggests that people may have gathered first for belief, ritual, feasting, death, fear, or sacred obligation, and that farming may have followed because large gatherings needed to be fed. If that is true, then civilization did not begin only because humans wanted more food. It may have begun because humans wanted meaning strong enough to pull scattered groups together around stone, blood, animals, and the unseen world. The pillars do not feel like ordinary construction. Many stand in pairs, towering over the center of the enclosures like silent human-like beings without faces. Their carved animals do not appear gentle or decorative. They are predators, scavengers, venomous creatures, and wild things that would have mattered deeply to people living before domesticated safety. Vultures may point toward death rituals. Snakes may suggest danger, rebirth, or the underworld. Foxes and boars may carry meanings we can no longer recover. The site feels less like a village temple and more like a place where people confronted forces they feared, respected, or believed they had to control. The labor behind it is almost as mysterious as the symbolism. The builders quarried huge stones, shaped them with stone tools, transported them, carved them, and raised them in carefully arranged spaces. This required coordination, planning, food, leadership, and shared purpose. Yet the people involved left no writing to explain who commanded the work, who performed the rituals, or why the site mattered enough to attract generations. No king's name survives, no priestly text tells us the chants spoken there, no myth explains why the animals were carved into stone. The builders were capable of extraordinary organization, but they remain almost completely anonymous. Then the mystery turns darker. Göbekli Tepe was not simply abandoned. At some point, its enclosures were deliberately buried. The people who inherited or used the site filled the sacred spaces with soil, rubble, bones, and debris, sealing the pillars beneath the earth. That act was too careful to be accidental. They did not let the place decay naturally. They entombed it. A monument that had required enormous labor to build was covered over by human hands, hidden so completely that it remained lost for thousands of years. The question is unavoidable. Why would a people bury their own sacred world? Perhaps the burial marked the end of a ritual cycle. Perhaps the beliefs changed. Perhaps the place became dangerous, polluted, outdated, or too powerful to leave exposed. Perhaps the people who buried it were not destroying it, but protecting it, returning it to the earth as part of a ceremony whose meaning is gone. Whatever the reason, the act gives Göbekli Tepe its haunting power. It was not only built before civilization was supposed to build such things, it was also erased by the people who understood it best. That is why Göbekli Tepe belongs among the lost civilizations that may be older than history. And it is not a city in the usual sense, but it reveals a level of shared belief, labor, symbolism, and social coordination that forces the beginning of civilization into deeper darkness. Before writing, before agriculture fully remade the world, before kings claimed to speak for gods, people were already gathering to raise carved pillars toward the sky. And then, after generations of effort, they buried them. Göbekli Tepe does not simply ask who built it. It asks what kind of human world existed before farming, and why that world chose to hide its most sacred stones from the future. Number 1. Sundaland, the drowned homeland beneath Southeast Asia. Long before the modern map of Southeast Asia existed, there was another world between the islands. During the last ice age, sea levels were much lower than they are today, and the shallow seas around Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Borneo exposed a vast landmass now called Sundaland. What is now ocean was once river valley, forest, plain, coastline, and fertile lowland. People could have walked across regions that are now separated by deep blue water. Great rivers flowed through the exposed shelf. Animals moved across connected habitats. Human groups lived, hunted, fished, gathered, and perhaps built early communities in a tropical world that has vanished beneath the sea. What makes Sundaland so haunting is not only that it drowned, but that it may have drowned a chapter of human complexity we have barely begun to imagine. The usual story of civilization begins in places that remained above water: Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, and the Andes. But the best places for early people to settle were often coastlines and river mouths, exactly the places most vulnerable to rising seas after the Ice Age. Sundaland had rivers, fish, forests, rainfall, plants, animals, and movement routes across one of the richest environments on Earth. If early complex societies developed there, the ocean may have taken almost all of the evidence before writing preserved their names. The flooding did not happen in a single day. As the ice sheets melted, the sea rose in pulses, forcing people to move again and again. And a shoreline known to one generation might be gone by the next. A village near a river mouth could become an island, then a reef, then a memory beneath water. People would have watched fishing grounds change, forests drown, graves disappear, and paths between communities turn into straits. Unlike a city destroyed by war, Sundaland was erased by geography itself. The land did not burn, it sank. And when the water covered it, the houses, camps, tools, gardens, bones, and stories of its people were placed beyond reach. This is why the idea of a drowned homeland beneath Southeast Asia feels so powerful. Across many island and coastal cultures, there are flood stories, migration memories, and traditions of ancestors arriving from lands lost to the sea. These stories cannot be treated as simple proof of a vanished civilization, but they cannot be dismissed lightly either. A human memory often preserves catastrophe in the form of myth. A people forced to flee rising water may not keep exact maps for thousands of years, but they may keep the emotional truth. There was once land where now there is sea, and the ancestors came from a world that drowned. The archaeological problem is brutal. If a settlement lies under a desert, we can dig. If a city lies under jungle, we can scan from above. But if a prehistoric homeland lies beneath the Java Sea or the South China Sea, every search becomes expensive, difficult, and uncertain. Sediment shifts, coral grows, currents bury and expose surfaces, wood rots, shorelines move. The environments most likely to hold early human communities are the hardest to investigate now. That means absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Sundaland may have been empty of anything we would call civilization, or it may have held early experiments in settlement, trade, ritual, and seafaring whose remains are now hidden under mud. What we do know is that people in this region were not passive survivors. The ancestors of island Southeast Asians and later Pacific voyagers belong to some of the greatest maritime traditions in human history. Long before modern navigation, humans crossed water, settled islands, understood currents, built boats, and carried culture across distances that would have seemed impossible from landlocked theories of prehistory. Sundaland may have been the bridge, the nursery, or the lost centre from which some of that knowledge spread. If so, the drowning of the shelf was not just environmental change. It was the breaking apart of a human world. That is why Sundaland belongs at number 1 among the lost civilizations that may be older than history. It is not a confirmed empire waiting with stone palaces under the waves. It is something more disturbing, a vast missing landscape in one of the most important regions of human migration, drowned before written memory, where early complexity might have flourished and archaeology can barely reach. If civilization had older beginnings along tropical coasts, Sundaland is one place where the evidence may have gone under. The sea did not only separate islands, it may have swallowed one of humanity's forgotten beginnings, leaving us with myths, genetics, drowned riverbeds, and the feeling that history's first chapters may be lying beneath the water.